Well, everyone, I think that's time. Okay, we'll get the show on the road then. Unless the Orgcom tells me not to get started, we'll keep going. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final of the Berlin IB Online 2020. My name is Rob. I'll be the chair today. I'm joined on the panel by a lot of wonderful judges. Where's the list gone? And we'll just go around and introduce ourselves and make sure that everyone's audio is working, that we're all connected and everyone's here. So have we got Danny?
Yeah, I'm here.
Katharina?
Yep.
Beautiful. Lorna?
Yeah.
And Rock?
Hey.
Fantastic. And we have 4 brilliant teams who've also done a great job making it so far. So congratulations to all of them. A hearty virtual clap for them. Do we have opening government, real pandemics have curves? I can see you both. I'm going to guess you're working. Do we have quarantine, scrappy and hungry? Yep, a great Hamilton reference. A license and a penance?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yes,
And we have LSECM.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Or one of, yeah.
All right, both of you are here. All good then. The rules of debating, as far as I'm aware, are still the same for this round as they were last round. So without any further ado then, on the motion, this House believes that in times of severe crisis, individuals have a moral obligation to dedicate themselves towards combating the crisis. We invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate. Here.
Just one thing before you start, to remind people, nobody uses the chat. If you use the chat, you will be kicked out of the Zoom. So just, not nobody, sorry. Nobody that's not a speaker or a judge uses the chat, okay? Okay.
That sounds great. Take it away, Prime Minister, when you're ready.
In crisis, like war, like disease, like hunger, there is 2 options. You can or try to help only yourself, do the best thing for you in every turn, or do the thing that is right for society and help and help as much many people that you can get out of it. In some cases, this is not mutually exclusive, but in a lot of cases, it does. Let's say the corona, when there's a corona break, staying in quarantine, sometimes even if you're young and your chances to get it or to lose from it is very small, is crucial. Even though it might hurt you to stay, even though you're not in danger, it will help a lot of other people. And even though it's going to hurt you, sometimes mentally, sometimes physically, you should do it. Sometimes giving the money that you got from the government and paying it back to some organization to give it to people who need it more is your obligation. Not hoarding, not taking as much toilet paper or medicine or food as you want, even though you're taking some risk that you might not get it in the future, is something your obligation in order to make sure that as much people can do it. You don't need to kill yourself, but you should take some amount of suffering in order to help the other people. You have 3 metrics or why this is your moral obligation. First of all, on the utilitarian level. Secondly, why in those situations not helping others is actively harming them. And thirdly, why you have a civil duty to help other people in crisis. First, let's talk about utilitarianism. Look, there is always in those crises someone who is more hurt than you. There is always someone that taking your money or taking your help or taking some of your medicine or some of your food will help him more. Look, it is true anytime, okay, right now. But in crisis, this trade-off is extreme, okay? In regular times, when you have someone poor, you have other mechanisms to help them. Maybe taxes, maybe someone else will help him. Maybe if I'll just use the money today on myself, I'll have more money in the future and I could give them. There's a lot of places to take it. In crisis, when you have someone that his parents died in the war and has no one else, you have someone in hospital that without your help will die from the disease. If you have someone who will starve without because you are holding food, this is critical. The amount of good that you are going to get to yourself versus the amount of harm you're going to do to someone else is such an extreme that we think it's a moral obligation. Look, when you see someone that is about to drown in a river, even though that, and you have the possibility to help him and save him, even though you take some kind of risk on yourself, maybe even ruin your suit, we think that when you have this option and you can save him, and there is no real option that someone else will do it, it is your moral obligation to do it. And if you're not doing it, you are a immoral man. Secondly, we think that in those kind of cases, not helping other people is actively harming them. Why? Because there's a lot of situations when there is need a collective action in order to fix problems. Look, when a lot of the time, if you think only about yourself, whatever specifically you are doing might not change a lot. Okay, if I heard a little bit, I'm not changing the situation. If I'm breaking quarantine, I'm not changing the situation. But if all of us are doing it, you will never be able to make enough quarantine to block the disease. It's more than that. Even other people who want to be in quarantine, their actions will be worthless and they will think that they cannot do it. Only when all of us as a society, when it's an obligation, it's a rule that if everyone else would follow, this is only when we will help everyone. We think that this is kind of rule that every kind of a moral obligation works for. Okay, sometimes stealing is all right; it will help me. But we think that in general, we believe if everyone will steal when he thinks he's right, the world will be worse. The same thing happened here. This is a rule that if everyone will stay in quarantine, everyone will not hoard food, everyone will help someone who suffers next to him when he can, our world will be a lot better. And it is impossible if not the majority of us are doing it. CO can have your extension.
Do you think average individuals are responsible for crises such as the coronavirus?
I think that if you have mask in your house, or if you have medicine in your cabinet and you are not sick, and your neighbor is sick and he might die now if he doesn't get this medicine and you doesn't bring it to him, even though you're taking a risk, you are an immoral man. This is the cases we're talking about. Thirdly, let's talk about your civil duty. Okay, we think that when we are a part of a society, when we have a social contract is not only about paying some taxes and walking on the same roads. It's about our fate. It's about our life. We are a part of the same group, and we need to take care about each other. Look, when I'm usually paying taxes and I want to get the welfare when I get it. In a lot of cases, it's not only a part of us are going to. New York will get into a war, even though there's going to be problems only in the border with Mexico. Okay, one country is usually a group of people that takes a lot of risk together and decide that they are going to help each other when there's wrong. Look, every day, okay, we have a mechanism to fulfill this duty. This mechanism is called a government, okay? A government takes taxes from me, and then it distributes it to the people who need it the most. And we think that in general times, it is enough to fulfill this duty because the government can do it. It's usually enough. I'm voting democratically for leaders who will fulfill my duties as as my civil duty. But we think that in those specific cases of crises, government is not enough, and I need to do specific actions myself. Why? Because first of all, in those crises, a lot of time government can't do it. When there's a huge crisis like war or like a plague, the government can't get to all of the people who need this help, and only sometimes it's only we can do it. And I have the obligation. I don't have any other mechanism to help them. Can I have your case maybe? I tried. Look, and we think that when I say in crises, I can't rely on the government to fulfill this duty. I need myself not to hoard food. I need myself to have someone who might die from thirst or from hunger. I need myself given medicine. I need to quarantine myself because the government a lot of the times won't take this duty to make sure that everyone or don't have enough policemen to do that. And we think that in those cases, you have to do it. Look, governments, it's just a mechanism. It doesn't put me in jail or take my taxes because it's a mechanism that I had to get in like a debate competition. It's a manifestation of a contract that I took myself when I became a part of this society, when I took an obligation and I got something. And we think that when you are in a crisis, when everything is falling down, when other people need your specific help, it is your civil duty to help them. So I told you that on the utilitarian level, we told you that at the principle level, and we told you that at your civil duty, you are obliged morally to help others and not yourself in the crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now have the opposition leader up to begin the op bench. Here.
Can everyone hear me? Cool.
Yeah.
Take my stopwatch. Okay. 3, 2, 1. The case of the opening government is either logically unsound or completely uncomparative. Most of the time, it's both. We're going to give you 4 principal points as to why this obligation does not exist. But first of all, let's clarify something on the framework which takes opening government out of the picture. On the example of the coronavirus and staying home, we said all of this amounts to a duty of doing no harm, of not actively precluding others, knowing that you will preclude them from following their conception of the good and retaining their right to life. And we're happy to stand behind that. The word dedicate means that the vast majority of your skills, the vast majority of your time, and even at the expense of high personal sacrifice, you should devote your life to helping individuals within the crisis. Know that this is also not liable to caveats. So opening government cannot caveat this to people who are well situated, or you should jump in a river, even if you're in your suit. Yes, but you should not jump into the river if you can drown, which we say that is a very high possibility in these kinds of situations. Now moving on to our case. First of all, there is an exclusive moral contradiction within the case of open government. First of all, the reason why open government and CG, whatever they run, believe that this moral obligation exists is because they believe that this moral obligation furthers some kind of values which they believe to be absolute. These are things such as the right to life, the right to the pursuit of happiness, the right to bodily autonomy from external influences. These are the things they want to save individuals from, right? But in order to believe that, they need to believe that every individual has a unique moral right and claim to these rights which we believe inhere in the human condition. Therefore, what is the necessary contradiction that governments need to contend with? If those inhere in every human being because they're unique moral actors, then there is no way for them to claim that the right of another, who I am potentially going to save, is more important than my individual claim to life and than my individual claim to pursuit of happiness that I'm necessarily going to sacrifice. And this is where we have the distinction between a nice thing to do and a moral obligation. I would ask the opening government, would they legally require people and persecute people who do not sign donor cards? Because it may well be a nice thing of me to donate my organs. It's still an immoral thing to take them forcibly away from me if I haven't signed the consent form, because we believe that my bodily autonomy is equal to the bodily autonomy of the person who is truly worse off than me dying from lung cancer, right? So to the extent which they cannot dismantle this claim philosophically, they probably lose out on this clash. Because also on the utilitarian metric, they tend to fail here. Because I help other people. But in order to do that, I have to sacrifice my definition of the pursuit of happiness. Because in no way in this motion is it fiated that people will deeply believe that they're doing the right thing. Moral obligations exist regardless of people's convictions, right? To the extent to which I help another individual, I am sacrificing myself and vice versa. So to the extent to which they cannot claim any kind of moral differentiation here, they probably fail. But the second thing I want to point you to is that they have to defend this claim in the absolute. Sure, no one is guilty of corona, but a lot of crises, like economic crises and wars and revolutions, tend to be the fault of the state, to whom you've already given a significant amount of your rights to control your entire livelihood through basically all of their policies, and who still continue to keep you in line through coercive mechanisms like the police and the army. To that extent, if someone has directly victimized you and you are already in a position that your individual faculties are probably not nearly enough as as is the faculties of the state who may have already put you in this position. We said what government requires of people is of victims to take care and resolve their own victimization in a significant amount of cases. We say that if you have given your trust and your rights to someone else to safeguard you, and that someone else has fucked up, we say that that in no way is contingent on you having more responsibility unless you were able to perfectly bridge the asymmetry of information and know that they were going to fuck up. But also, given the system is coercive and you cannot opt out of being in a state in general, the system forces you, in order for you to retain your physical liberty and all the faculties you need to survive, the system forces you to put your trust in someone else. So when that someone else fucks up and you had no agency to consent to not giving that trust to someone, you're necessarily not responsible for their mistakes because they're in a position of power towards you. But thirdly, we are perfectly happy to concede some genesis of moral duties. The first is consent. But what is important here? That nobody in government can claim to know what an objective moral good is. There is no epistemological access in government for them to claim that me helping someone in a crisis is morally superior to any other kind of action unless they can claim that one moral framework is necessarily better than the other. To this extent, the only value we can claim or want to prioritize is the value of the maximization of individual bodily autonomy to the extent to which individuals do not preclude each other actively with intent to having this bodily autonomy. Because only the individual has full access to their own repositories of experience, of thoughts, and of morals, which means that they best for themselves can decide what is their definition of happiness. Given that happiness is the reason why we think that moral obligations and rights exist in the first place, to safeguard and maximize our ability to access happiness, we say the government necessarily goes against this. To the extent to which there is no absolute moral good, we say the only duty you have is to commit no harm. But if you did not consent to claiming a moral obligation which stems from a specific framework, which we cannot claim is superior to your framework, then we necessarily take away your agency as a moral actor. Before I move on, I'll take closing government.
So Jen, a lot of your analysis seems to be reliant on this notion that you would need to self-sacrifice in order to help another person. The reality is combating a crisis can be done in a variety of ways, none of which entail self-sacrifice, often by only small acts.
Tudor, my first point relies on that. My other three do not. Rebut them. Okay. Secondly, consequences of actions. We say that individuals have a duty to take care of the consequences of what they've done. But to the extent to which crises are very often unpredicted, even if they're external like Corona, we said given that there is no moral responsibility or causal link between you and the consequence, this does not mean that you in particular have a moral obligation to take care of that, right? Because in no way have you broken any moral codes for that crisis to happen. Therefore, my responsibility point stays. But lastly, and most importantly, crises are very often morally contentious. One man's war is another man's revolution. The downfall of capitalism, if I believe in communism, is the right thing. Unless you can determine what is the correct ideology, and unless you have full epistemological knowledge of what moral framework to prioritize over the other, we say that given different levels of moral priorities, we cannot universally state that individuals have a moral obligation towards situations which are necessarily morally contentious. So if you buy nothing else from my speech, this means that government cannot stand and it adheres in the motion. For all of those reasons, opening opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. We now cross back the floor to the government side to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. You're here.
I would have a fair amount of rebuttal, and now I'm going to do something a bit more clever than what OO wants. They said, and I quote, if you don't, your only moral obligation is to commit no harm. What I'm going to show to you is that at the point where the crisis happened, you have in fact already caused the moral harm. So all you are left with is to compensate for the moral harm that you have already done. And there is a moral obligation to compensate for the harms that you have done. This is what I will do in my speech. Before that, quite a bit of rebuttal to what we have heard from Tim. One, he says there is a duty of doing no harm. Please notice, we absolutely agree. Amichai has told you that in times of crisis, it's very hard to just do no harm. In fact, anything less of dedication would result in harming others. It's very easy for them to say, obviously you shouldn't break quarantine, but to the people who break quarantine, they don't think they are harming others, they think they are helping themselves. And the amount that they harm others is incredibly minimal, right? That is exactly the type of a problem. If they really believe that your only obligation is doing absolutely no harm, we say the only way to make sure that you're doing no harm in your life is probably to do extra and dedicate yourself into helping others to offset the probable chance that you have in fact caused harm. Then they said there can be no caveats. Dedication is no caveats. Dedication means risking everything. No, I have dedicated around 10 years to debating. I would not commit suicide for debating. Let's be real. It means that there is some toll on you, and we've told you that from the beginning. And if they do not like the definition, maybe they should have been OG, but they are not. Then they told us that every individual has a right. It can't be, you can't sacrifice your rights just for others. We don't understand why. We told you there is a balance. Sometimes you shouldn't do it, but there are times that you should, especially if you can help people a lot, like the example of jumping into the river when the only cost is ruining your favorite suit. Still is something that you should do, and they agree that this is something you should do. They said, would you legally require to donate organs? Please notice, this has nothing to do with legally obligating something. Moral obligation and legal obligations are separate things, but do you have a moral obligation to donate your organs after you die? Of course. You are dead and you are not using those organs, then it absolutely is your moral obligation. Then he said that many crises is the fault of states. I will talk about this directly in my speech. And then he said something very well. He said, we just can't objectively know many things. We can't objectively know what is better. The only thing we know is bodily autonomy. First, that sounds somewhat objective and you just made it up from thin air. But B, we're saying that we always do it to an extent. For example, obviously you are saving a kid's life. Your bodily autonomy is to somewhat impaired because you might be wet. Getting wet is some harm to your bodily autonomy, but it's a very low harm. So again, there is a balance here, and they fail to admit that balance in times of severe crisis. Finally, they said a crisis is very hard to morally identify. We say sure, but the motion says it's a severe crisis. We don't know what a severe crisis is, but the motion does, and it gave us the epistemological certainty that this is a time of crisis. One last thing. CEO says, are regular people responsible for coronavirus outbreak? Absolutely. If everyone in the world could stay at home for 3 weeks and not live out, there would be no corona virus. It would be done in literally 3 weeks. So yes, regular people are at fault. Let's talk about why we believe that people are at fault. Look, we believe that basically people one of the moral obligations that they have is to right their wrongdoing. The idea is very simple. If you agree that you should not commit harm, please notice something that O always told us that they agree to. That means that you also must agree that if you have created the wrongdoing, you should fix it in some way. Now, you don't necessarily know how to, but nonetheless, it is your moral obligation to do so. We say that at times of crisis, it's very likely that you have created harm and you now need to pay that back to society. I will explain to you how in a second, but before that, I would like a POI. Let's take a POI from opening, sure.
Killing a terminally sick man to take his organs and save 6 other people makes sense on the level of utility and does not change much for the terminally ill man. Does he have a moral obligation to commit suicide to save other people before they die of organ failure?
If he is terminally ill and he would die anyway, yes, absolutely he has that ability. He could save 6 people and at very minimal cost to himself because he would die anyway. Yes, it is his moral obligation. And again, we tell you, you're talking about a person that has done nothing wrong, and it's very hard to do the calculus. We're saying that in times of severe crisis, the calculus is a lot easier. And as we told you, because it's very easy to understand who it's very easy to know that whatever your contribution is very meaningful, and so on, and everything else that Amichai has told you. Why do we believe that the damage was already done at crisis? So a few reasons. A, Tien himself tells us that many crises are made by the state. Who voted for the state? Who gave the state the money with taxes with which they used to make that crisis? Please notice, every one of you did it. Now, they are saying, but you didn't do it knowingly. That means nothing. If I hit you with your car, that might have been an accident and I didn't do it knowingly. I would still pay you for your medical treatment because it is me who is responsible. By the fact that a lot of people in our society voted for that government, we are saying they are responsible. Please notice, those are the majority of people right there and then. I have my phone died. What time is it?
You're at 6:13.
Okay, thank you. Secondly, we're saying, please notice that by living in a state of severe crisis, you are already taking resources. And we're telling you, in times of severe crisis, those resources are scarce by definition. By the mere living and consumption of these resources, you are, to an extent, taking them from other people. Now, please notice, there is no reason to believe that you have needed those resources more than other people. Maybe you paid more for them, but that means nothing. Just means that you had more money. So we're saying that the mere fact that in a time of scarcity, instead of being part of a system that distributes those resources, you just decided to take them. Again, you have already created a harm. You've taken a scarce resource. Finally, we're saying you're taking part of a system, of a global system, for example, that makes sure that people who are poor cannot afford to eat, that limits how much access people have to certain resources and so on. You have benefited from that system so far before the crisis, but now we say it is the time to pay. So we're saying because the harm was done by you already before the crisis has happened, perhaps unknowingly, but that doesn't matter. You have the obligation to give it back. We beg you to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We now have the Deputy Opposition Leader up to conclude the top half.
Panel, the DPN's response to our POI presupposes that in any situation where there is someone worse off than you should be expected to commit any sacrifice to the extent to which that sacrifice is lower than whatever the burden on that other person is. So the consequences of their case is that individuals would have a moral obligation to basically forfeit their entire lives. They can't stand for that because you cannot claim that the life of a person is morally more significant than the life of another. I.e., you cannot force every single individual to instrumentalize their own lives at their own personal cost in order to try to help other people. Look, even if I were to concede that a world in which everyone takes on Peter Singerest's moral burdens on them and acts on them might be a better world, that doesn't mean that that moral obligation actually exists. It would probably be a better world if everyone would have moral obligations to do a lot of things, but those aren't reasons to just assume that those moral obligations exist because we think that world would be better, right? So I will be looking at what dedication presupposes and why that is too much of a burden to place on individuals, and that is something that we morally cannot stand for. And then I will talk about how crises are all kinds of things. So even if the burden government ones were to exist, it would probably still fail on the metrics they set for themselves. But also, like, just let's look at some of the rebuttals they have given, because they say, you voted for the state, so you're morally responsible. Like, okay, does that mean that like roughly 40-45% of the people in any state don't have a moral responsibility at all that everyone else has simply because they happen to vote for a person? Like, I don't think that is true. I also don't think that most people who voted for Boris Johnson realized he was going to be such a fucking idiot that he would think that, oh, if a bunch of people die, it's fine because everyone else will have herd immunity, blah, blah, blah. I genuinely don't think that you can claim that. But also, if you were to extend that logic, then everyone in shaky democracies who happen to vote for a government is morally responsible for oppression committed by that government. I don't think that is something you can genuinely claim. But also, Let's look at their utilitarian metric. Because I think they're not entirely correct in evaluating the utilitarian consequences. But even if the utilitarian consequences were exactly as they paint them, right? In saying that it's better for you as well if you have this if you have this responsibility. Please notice we don't even have moral responsibilities as actors to do what's best for ourselves, right? I can smoke my lungs out if I want to. I only have a responsibility for my flatmate to make sure that I don't ruin her lungs with my choices. If I want to watch Netflix every day and have a drink every day instead of studying and working and being productive during this quarantine, that is actively bad for me, but I don't think I'm a morally bad person because I choose to make that choice, right? But not only that, it's probably not practically better for you in all cases because of the fact that, one, it requires a large amount of people making the same sacrifice, and they are unlikely to make so. And that probably means that you are very likely to make a lot of sacrifices for absolutely no benefit, or for very marginal benefits that are in no way proportional to the sacrifice you have input that other people get to ride freely on. But also just the idea of if the government isn't around to save the drowning person, then you have the responsibility to do so. So that extends to, because it's a crisis and the government can't respond, it means you have the responsibility to intervene. But I'm not sure how the government failing one of its responsibilities, i.e. taking care of the citizens, i.e. either preventing or successfully managing the crisis, necessarily means that me, as a harmed party by the state having failed its responsibility, takes on that responsibility. That would mean that literally every single person in developing countries is responsible for building roads and fixing everything because their government is unable to do so. That is absolutely insane. But also, just this whole practical level of otherwise we'll never solve the crisis, otherwise things would never happen, otherwise things would be worse. Again, just because you think the world will look better if something happens, doesn't mean you actively, personally have the responsibility to do so. I think there is a very large difference. So now to move on to the idea of sacrifice and what the burdens in this debate actually are. I think there is a very large difference between not causing harm in society versus dedicating your life to trying to redress any harm that might have been caused by other parties, right? First, I don't think we're necessarily responsible, or rather, to the extent that I caused a crisis, I probably have a responsibility because of having personally created that crisis, probably not just because I happen to be a citizen of a country, right? Even if I have done something that is actually stupid, but I have done so because my state told me it's okay. See how most governments in Europe, right before the quarantine, were still allowing us to travel everywhere and do everything and have gatherings and concerts. Even if I had done that and thus actively contributed to making the corona crisis worse, I still wouldn't think that I have a moral responsibility to redress it because I didn't make the moral choice to harm someone, and it is not my fault that I did so. But also, I think the responsibility to do no harm in the times of corona already covers a lot of the things that government wants, right? Going out and super spreading is a harm directly and exclusively caused by my action, right? And they say, but people who break quarantine, they don't think they are harming, they are just helping themselves. The problem is that it doesn't matter whether they think they are just helping themselves or not, that is still a moral responsibility that they have and that they're breaking, right? It doesn't mean that because they are breaking one moral responsibility, we should impose another one on them just to make sure they compensate for that. But also the idea, Tudor's POI basically, dedicate is a very strong moral imperative, right? It doesn't mean wear a mask and help your neighbor. It implies a priority, urgency, and scale that requires a lot of sacrifice and putting a lot of things aside. DPM says, I have dedicated a lot for debating, but I wouldn't die for it. We're not necessarily saying you are saying we should die, right? But you have still probably hurt yourself a lot by putting off exams, spending ridiculous amounts of time and money and all of those things. And if you have chosen to do so, you don't necessarily have a responsibility to dedicate even more. Let's look at crises, because it can be all kinds of things. It can be corona, but it can be civil wars, economic crisis. It can be climate change, right? Multiple crises can happen simultaneously. Often there is no clear resolution. There's imperfect, asymmetric information, and there is no epistemological insight into A, what is the right thing to do, or B, what is the priority. I should have the right to decide what I want to dedicate my life to if I want to do so, right? Agency and self-determination are prerequisites for me to even be a moral actor in the first place. Government is infringing on that. I am very proud to oppose.
Sorry, Robert, I think you're muted. You were muted.
Could people hear me introduce you?
I don't think so, but I think that's okay.
It's your turn to speak now anyway.
One sec. Okay. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, excellent. Okay. Panel, 3 points of extension from closing government today. But before we do that, let's do a bit of extraneous rebuttal and clarify some things regarding the metrics and sort of larger framework this debate takes place in. So when I asked, Tin the POI, whether given there are many forms of action to combat this kind of crisis, many of them not entailing self-sacrifice, that clearly, I said, means that you don't have to harm your bodily autonomy. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of people will not have to harm their bodily autonomy to do that. Tin then admitted that his first criterion then disappears, and we've effectively rebutted that, so that's good knowledge. But I also want to point out that he's already also admitted to something else, which is key for understanding the frameworks of this debate, namely that there are clearly tiers of moral obligation, even if after we establish moral obligation. Why is that? Because obviously, to some degree, moral obligation must be dependent on the ability to act, right? On your capacity to fulfill that moral obligation. So a few intuition pumps. You would not ask a child to step into treating pneumonia of a patient, right? Even though you might say they have a moral obligation to do something, stay home, you would not ask them to treat pneumonia. You would not ask a disabled person, right, to volunteer on the front line of a natural disaster if they can't do so, right? So there's clearly limits towards the degree of self-sacrifice we're likely to ask, and clearly there are tiers of moral obligation depending on ability. The things we're likely to see in terms of what combating means are things like private practices, or for example, things you do in your own home, self-isolation, of course, for medical professionals to go on the front lines of this and solve it if it's a pandemic, but also to volunteer, right, to help in, in natural disasters, providing relief in the most stricken areas, or obviously donations, which are, if anything, the most dependent on ability type of moral obligation, right? Because if you just don't have the money, you cannot fulfill that, but you probably can act in different ways, right? So again, there's tiers of moral obligation. That's clearly true. Now, I want to jump into the free extensions coming from closing government. So first of all, I want to, on a more philosophical moral point, I think Tin is correct that there is no objectively correct moral framework, right? Objectively correct. Well, okay, but if this is true, then clearly we have to wonder, where do we get these moral truths or attempts at moral truths? And the response is indeed, and I'm going to channel Darian a bit here, there is no objective moral truth, right? It cannot exist, and if it would exist, right, it would be this intangible, incomprehensible thing that we don't understand at all. Then the reality is, the source of morality, right, is only individual humans that will morality into existence, right? So their ability to will it into existence and provide for themselves unique subjective experiences, right? Again, unique subjective experiences, so that which cannot be related to others people's unique subjective experiences, right? That source of will, right, of willing into existence morality is especially crucial. In that scenario, you as an individual have a duty to do whatever maximally possible to be efficient in protecting as many wills, if you will, right, as many generations of those morality as possible, right, because you have to protect that unique subjective experience that adheres in far more people and in far more different ways than you do, and because they are equally valid creatures of morality, losing any one of them would be a disaster, especially when it is preventable by your your action, right? Given the tiers of obligation I've already outlined. So that empowers a lot more the moral case, given the sources of morality. Individuals are sources of morality in and of themselves. We have to protect those unique subjective experiences because those are will which generate multiplicatively many morality forms of morality. But second point of extension, and here we get more, more concrete, right? I want to point out that we have here in my second and third point of extension far more direct forms of moral obligation than opening government identifies. Because OG talk a lot, for example, about utilitarianism. Indeed, that in some instances is quite a distant calculation, right? No, there are far more direct forms of moral obligation. One, moral indebtedness already accrued, and two, often directly causative acts you've taken to making others vulnerable to crisis. So, entering those, first of all, recognize there is a moral indebtedness which you've already accrued to specific individuals. Recognize that in normal times, so non-crisis times, a set of individuals, a limited set of individuals, take on an excessive and unnecessary amount of moral obligation to keep things normal. Doctors, firefighters, policemen, every day take on an unnecessary and unrequested, right, amount of moral obligation and burden upon themselves to keep things normal, right? Doctors keep normal medical practices running and treat illnesses. Policemen, keep the criminality low in normal times, and so on. These are huge moral burdens and indebtedness which is accrued to them. Crucially, these people prop up all of society and all of the normal, ongoings of society by taking on that moral burden, and thus other people which benefit from that accrue that moral indebtedness. Crucially, in normal times, we don't repay it. Look at the salaries of doctors, look at the salaries of firefighters, right? These are overwhelmingly horrible and their conditions of work are horrible. Why? Because we don't feel the importance of their work. Because we feel it doesn't affect us and we forget and overlook it. So then there is a great moral debt which has not been paid, but has been massively accrued throughout all the period of normalcy, which has surpassed. This moral debt must be repaid. And the moment to repay it, right, is by solidarity in the moments in which these people, doctors, soldiers, firefighters, need it most, i.e. the maximal amount of, the moments of crisis where these people are especially stretched, right, are the most stretched. Doctors, soldiers, and so on are the most stretched within moments of crisis, pandemics, wars, whatever they are. Those are the moments where you have a moral indebtedness because you can help because they are stretched, right, even if you're not a professional, right, but crucially, you're also repaying a very distinct, clear, and calculatable moral indebtedness which has been accrued. No, but third point of extension here. So crucially, I also want to point out that Tim keeps saying, there is no causative connection. You didn't cause the coronavirus. Thus, if you weren't the bat which caused the coronavirus, it's not on you, it's fine, right? Okay, but you've definitely contributed substantially and causatively to making many people far more vulnerable to the effects of that crisis, right? How is that? Well, crucially, by normal ways of life, which almost everyone partakes in, right? Things such as climate change, which are fueled by every individual's travel, every individual's, commercial success and consumption, right?
In closing opposition, we're going to be a bit funky because we're going to try and problematize an aspect of this debate which has largely been assumed, and then to break the government that moral obligations don't exist in a vacuum. They're all relative to other things, and we have to prioritize different moral obligations against each other at any one point because we always have to make trade-offs. Therefore, what we're going to do is take government at their best and say if all the obligations which they say exist do exist based on all of the criteria to prioritize specific crises and allocate moral responsibility then versus ongoing crisis and slaughtering of billions of people who suffer from poverty around the world, and critically billions of people who in future generations who have not come yet into existence but are going to have suffering on a much larger scale than the final crisis, which is the reasonable interpretation of this debate. No, this is not a knife of opening opposition because we agree on all of their things. We don't think these moral obligations exist. What we're doing in this argument is using both government teams' logic to show that if their arguments are true, the conclusion isn't true. So if the obligation exists, it is a misapplication of it to focus on it in times of crisis, and they're prioritizing it wrong, therefore proving that Gov is logically inconsistent, which we think is important in terms of taking down that case. First thing I want to note in framing versus closing government. closing government say that stress in the status quo is on doctors, etc. In a crisis that changes, so we have to take the pressure off. We think that in the status quo, the stress is on poor people who die every day from poverty on a much bigger scale than people are in the coronavirus, realistically, given this is global and also across time rather than in a specific period, which crises tend to be. We think if we agree, this is important, if we agree with both government teams, we have a consistent obligation to help the most vulnerable. Note, this is an implicit premise in all government teams because the only reason they pick in a time of crisis is to support vulnerable people, but they never justify why this is a legitimate parameter to set the debate such that this exists there, rather than being traded off with bigger ones. What we think is that the most vulnerable people in crisis and out with crisis are always the global poor, always people in the future who are being condemned to horrible, painful fates because we are wrecking the planet. No, this isn't just the people in your community who you can help during the time of coronavirus. This is everyone suffering everywhere. 800 million people, according to the World Bank, live below $2 a day, and this spans across time. This kind of oppression and suffering is much worse because in a time of crisis, we think of a before and after, and therefore it's temporally limited to some extent. But history for people who live in intergenerational poverty and suffering is cyclical. You have to go through the exact same suffering which your parents went through and people in the future go through. Opening governments say governments exist to manifest obligations and to embody these. I think this is true in a pragmatic sense, but no one shows why the things that moral obligations we have are restricted to helping your own political community, which only comes about in the time when they're in crisis, not crisis which is ongoing. A couple of points here. Focusing on curbing a current crisis necessarily excludes the ongoing crises which are happening for a couple of reasons. First of all, because so there's obviously an argument that helping a current crisis is the way to help future generations or the way to help the global poor. Even then, helping the crisis is a byproduct of the premier responsibility, moral responsibility, which is to help the most vulnerable people at any one point and alleviate that suffering, as opposed to help the crisis itself. So if you do save billions and billions and billions of people in the future by solving a crisis that would wipe out humanity or would cause horrible conditions for them, it matters which order the moral responsibilities come in, right? Because it's which one you're prioritizing. So it's not like we should never help crisis, but our criteria shouldn't be helping in that time of extreme crisis. That's important. This is important, secondly, because focusing on solving the crisis necessarily means you're not focusing on helping on other things. Just by virtue of individuals having limited resources, limited time, limited physical capacity to solve everything. So a day that you spend volunteering to help the corona crisis is a day that you're not spending towards massive poverty alleviation systems or doing what you can to help people who suffer there and be able to fix climate change or do things for massive people in the future. So there's always a trade-off. So what matters is which moral responsibility we want to prioritize if we buy into government's argument. So I think that's important. Yes, so I think there are two groups of people who are detached from the crisis, or can be, such that the focus should be put on them. So first of all, the global poor, we talked about, and second of all, future generations who will live in an uninhabitable world if we keep going. What's important? So why would we prioritize these people? I think, first of all, buying into the metrics which government teams said about helping people, you just win on the numbers game if you help everyone who's living in poverty all the time in status quo, or people in the future. More people have died from poverty than all individual crises combined. More people who exist in the future who have ever existed. So if you think they have any rights at all, they're the ones that you should focus your moral burden on prioritizing. Why do they have rights? First of all, although no one chooses where to be born, and therefore there's inequality there, no one also chooses when to be born. So we have this temporal birth lottery about what conditions you're subjected to at the point you're just born into existence, as everyone says, without your consent. A couple of other reasons that the people in the future have the least agency now, because the effects of what we're doing on the future, so climate change, are irreversible, but they have no capacity to even exercise mundane day-to-day agency in the present, and therefore we should prioritize them. I think other reasons that we'd focus on these are things like any ideas or values that we want to preserve can only exist if they're embodied within future generations and legacy. So if you care about any kind of moral framework at all, or any kind of thing to be passed on, you need generations to be able to preserve and uphold these things that we care about. I think another reason is it's unfair to generations in the past who dedicated themselves to the human project, but we're literally sacrificing this in our complicity with everything that we do on a day-to-day basis, which is wiping out people in the future and condemning them to either death or horrible kinds of existence. That's particularly important. So these are extra reasons, but I do think just helping the most people fulfills the moral burden which government teams want to defend and want to prove exists. But the second thing is culpability. So, say you're not culpable. I agree with this. You're not culpable in crisis specifically. But I think on government's metric, if this matters at all in this debate, and I think proved that probably to some extent it does, if you buy into government, then you're much more culpable for the kind of crises we're talking about, which are literally the status quo. Because any choice to actively participate or conform to social structures or social transactions necessitates complicity in making the global poor suffer and people in the future suffer, because it all contributes to wrecking the planet and killing everyone, which is effectively a mass genocide. We just don't think about it like that because we think in terms of like crisis or non-crisis time, because we're privileged enough to be able to make that distinction. That's important. I think crises, so yeah, I think both in terms of like the scale of the harm that happens, but also temporally, is a misprioritization of that. Note, if there is any ambiguity about the gov versus opening opposition class, we resolve this by proving that even if a government like more encouraged to oppose.
Thank you very excuse me, sorry. Thank you very much for your speech. And now to wrap up the CO case, the op bench, the debate, and indeed the whole of Berlin IV 2020, we welcome the opposition whip.
Can you guys hear me? Perfect. Government bench has missed two crucial points in this debate. Point number one, and I'm going to use Shishti's vocabulary here, normal time, diffuse responsibility, fails to recognize that people are in crisis all the time. Thomas Nagel says that since the beginning of the 21st century, more people have died of poverty than both Second World Wars combined, as well as the 2005 tsunami. This, in my mind, is a crisis. We pointed out that you don't think of this as a crisis because it's not happening to you. Your communal obligation selfishly leads you to specifically focus on things which affect you and your others, as opposed to people who are outside of your pertinent sphere of moral concern. Number two, they missed that your obligations discharged during the crises occur downstream of our moral obligations, because our moral obligations are the primary moral obligations, which are to the most vulnerable. Kira identified two groups here who are most vulnerable. Number one, the global poor, and number two, future generations. I'm going to show to you that I agree with opening opposition that there is no objective moral good, although I don't know why then they asserted an objective moral good, which is do no harm. But let's just assume that there's no objective moral good. I'm going to give you every moral framework which has existed in human history and show to you that we win the debate. Number one, consequentialism. We win the debate on two ways on consequentialism. We win because there are more people. Even the most conservative estimates put future generations at 10 to the power 34 biological life years. That is about 160 million times the number of people who have ever lived. If we can reduce the chances of them dying by 0.0001%, that's still 1,000 times more important than anything we could do right now. Number two, bang for your buck. So even if you use the same dollar, it helps poor people more than it helps using a dollar to help people in the coronavirus in your political community, because the poor can get more utility from that dollar. Number two, deontological responsibility, where we primarily talked about culpability, that you are exclusively culpable by your participation in the global institutional order and domestic social structures in what happens to the poor and what will happen to future generations. There are two things that I want to say here in response to CG here. The first thing, this intuition that, morality is a manifestation of the human will. Sure, Darian said this, but what Darian didn't realize is that this presupposes the existence of a human will. What about fucking future generations, which don't have a human will yet? Are they less important? What about past generations in terms of reparations, who do no longer possess a human will? Are you not responsible to these people anymore? The reality is that moral rights and duties do not stem from human manifestations of the human will. This is 2020, come up with a new argument. The second thing that I want to say about culpability is the intuition that's very important to realize that if culpability stems from crises, which is your point, then if we prove that this is a crisis and you just don't know it, culpability flows in this case. This is a literal crisis perpetuated by the global elite and also by every single one of us by our participation in the global elite structures. I think that's really important. The third metric is a prioritarian framework, which is to say who should be prioritized the most. We say that the people you should prioritize the most are the global poor. And here's where opening government comes in. Because opening government does something very interesting. They don't make a contribution-based argument, which is to say you contributed to the suffering of someone, hence you should help them. They make an assistance-based argument, which is to say just because you can help someone, you should help them, which is where we'll directly clash with them. One, I'll tell you that on contribution-based responsibilities, we're already winning from them. But why do we win on assistance-based responsibilities? Before that, I'll actually take OG. Please go ahead. Quickly, OG.
Yes, thank you, please notice, we have told you that most people are in fact in the moral debt and they should wrong it because they were part of the global systems that have contributed to that crisis, or the point that CG called moral indebtedness.
Okay, great. You weigh yourself off against your CG. Congratulations. But I'll still rebut that point because that was slightly disingenuous BOI. The response here is, if everyone else apart from me is culpable, then why am I responsible to them? Because if culpability is symmetric, which is say everyone caused a crisis, then surely there is no additional responsibility owed, because responsibility comes from an asymmetry of culpability. But on the prioritarian framework, I say that you should help the people who have least agency to help themselves. And here's where I use the example of most vulnerable, least responsible, and most responsible, least vulnerable. The people who are poor are least responsible for every crisis ever, but are most vulnerable to its impacts. The future, almost by definition of not existing, is most vulnerable to the things that we will do now, but is least responsible for them happening because they do not yet exist anymore. On the prioritarian framework, we also win. Framework number 4, this idea of a theological framework. Even if you're religious, every single moral wrong which stems from religion is apocalyptic. The idea that there will be hellfire, the idea that the Antichrist is coming. Even on a theological framework, we win, because if we prevent end times for humanity, that's good for us. Framework number 5, the intuition of moral luck. And I think this is really important. Why should you be helped only because you live in a community where a crisis happened? I just don't understand this. It's moral luck, right? Why was I born into a society where a crisis happened and now I'm getting help, but someone else isn't, just because a crisis isn't happening there? The elderly were always afflicted, not just during the coronavirus. Why is it that in places where the coronavirus has happened, the elderly are certainly getting assistance, but weren't otherwise? This is a problem of moral luck, and we break that by saying that the obligation exists in all cases, not just because of the luck or misfortune of being in that crisis. Number 6, moral hypocrisy. You are actively hypocritical by discharging these obligations in some cases and not others. Why? Here's where Kira's analysis comes in that Shrishti ignored. For the poor, crises are not linear. There is no before and there is no after for a crisis. Crises are cyclical. They exist for the entirety of your existence. You will walk 10 miles to get water. Your mother will walk 10 miles to get water, and your daughter will also walk 10 miles to get a water. Their life is a literal crisis, which means that it's much more important to ascertain the responsibilities towards those whose entire life flows from a human crisis as opposed to someone who doesn't. The last thing that I want to say is about OO, which I think is also really, really important. And here's what I say is that, contrary to what Tin says, we should jump in the pool even if we drown due to the obligations which are different, which I think is really, really important, because we're justifying individual responsibility from the lens of culpability. Realistically, in this debate, what we had to show to you were special obligations which come. We showed you that there's culpability. We've shown to you that even in terms of the contribution to communal heritage of humanity, you need future generations to exist. You can't have Islam if future generations don't exist. You can't have the Mawlis if future generations don't exist. On every metric we win, please give us a debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech, and thank you to everyone for a phenomenal grand final. A big virtual round of applause and high fives to everyone for a great job. All.com/adscore, where do the judges go to deliberate?
I'm making a breakout room for you right now. Please wait 30 seconds.
Thank you.
Judges, you should have all gotten an invite.